April 11th, 1945, Radar Picket Station, Number 1, 70 miles north of Okinawa. The destroyer USS Mannert L. Abele cuts through dark Pacific waters, her radar mast sweeping the sky for threats that will come without mercy. Ensign Robert Karr stands at his battle station, hands gripping the controls of a 5-inch gun mount. He's 23 years old, fresh-faced from Ohio, and he's been told these guns can knock planes from the sky. But what he doesn't know, what none of the Japanese pilots racing toward him know either, is that the shells in his magazines contain a secret that will rewrite the rules of naval warfare. The morning is deceptively calm. Seabirds circle overhead. The ship's radar operator, hunched over his glowing green screen, suddenly stiffens. Bogies. Inbound. Multiple contacts. 20 miles out and closing fast. The alarm screams through the ship. General quarters. All hands to battle stations. Karr's heart hammers as he watches the horizon. The kamikazes are coming, and they're coming in strength. Then he sees them, dots against the pale sky, growing larger, wings glinting in the early light. Zero fighters, Judy dive bombers, all loaded with explosives and piloted by men who've already written their farewell letters home. The Japanese call them Tokko Tai, the Special Attack Forces. Americans call them Kamikazes, Divine Wind. Either way, they're flying bombs guided by human hands, and they've sunk more American ships in the past 6 months than the entire Japanese surface fleet managed in 3 years of war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Abele's guns open fire. Karr's 5-inch mount erupts with a sound like thunder splitting metal. The shell races upward at 2,800 feet per second, spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute, its nose housing a mechanism the Japanese pilots cannot see, cannot imagine, and will never understand. 20 feet from a diving zero, the shell simply explodes. No impact, no timer running out, just instant detonation in mid-air. The zero disintegrates into a fireball of twisted aluminum and atomized fuel. The pilot never knew what killed him. Another burst. Another kamikaze shredded before it reaches the ship. Then another. The Japanese pilots press their attack with desperate courage, diving through walls of flak that seem impossibly accurate. They've been told American guns are good, but this is something else entirely. The shells are exploding all around them, not ahead or behind, but precisely where they are in the sky. It's as if the Americans can see the future, can predict exactly where each plane will be and when. Several kamikazes break through. One crashes into the Abele's stern. Minutes later, a second wave arrives, including something new, an Oka rocket bomb, a piloted missile launched from a bomber's belly and accelerating to over 600 miles per hour. The Abele takes the hit. The ship splits in two and sinks in less than 5 minutes. But here's what the historical record will later reveal. Of the 156 Japanese aircraft that attacked the radar picket stations that day, over 100 were destroyed before they could reach their targets. Not by fighters, not by lucky shots, but by something the Japanese High Command didn't believe was possible. American gunners were destroying aircraft they couldn't even see clearly, at ranges that should have been impossible, with a consistency that defied every principle of anti-aircraft warfare the Japanese understood. And they were doing it with a device so small it fit inside the nose of a standard artillery shell, yet so revolutionary it ranked alongside radar and the atomic bomb as one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. What the Japanese never knew was that they weren't just fighting American sailors, they were fighting American physics. In the spring of 1945, as kamikaze attacks reached their terrifying peak off Okinawa, American destroyers carried ammunition that could see. The VT fuse, officially called the variable time fuse to hide its true nature, was actually a miniature radar system small enough to survive being fired from a gun at 20,000 times the force of gravity. Each fuse contained a tiny radio transmitter and receiver, vacuum tubes no bigger than a pencil eraser, and circuitry packed in wax to survive the brutal acceleration. As the shell flew toward its target, it sent out radio waves. When those waves bounced back from an aircraft, the fuse detected the return signal and detonated the shell at precisely the right distance to shred the plane with shrapnel. The Japanese pilots had no idea. To understand what they faced, imagine this. You're flying a Zero fighter at 300 miles per hour, diving toward an American destroyer from 12,000 feet. You've trained for this mission. You know the Americans will fire timed shells that explode at preset altitudes, so you vary your approach, climbing and diving to throw off their calculations. You've seen other pilots survive by being unpredictable, but today, something is different. The American shells aren't exploding where you were or where you will be. They're exploding where you are, right now, in this exact moment. A shell passes 70 feet to your left, and suddenly the sky is metal. Another passes below, and your aircraft shudders as shrapnel tears through the wings. You try to evade, but the next shell anticipates your move. It's impossible, terrifying. You're fighting an enemy that can touch you through empty air. Back in Japan, intelligence officers received reports from the few pilots who survived these encounters. They described unprecedented accuracy, shells that seemed to follow aircraft, explosions that appeared where no timed fuse should have detonated. Some speculated about new radar techniques. Others thought the Americans had developed a way to aim guns that bordered on the supernatural, but none of them guessed the truth because the truth seemed technologically impossible. The forces involved in firing an artillery shell were so extreme that conventional wisdom said sensitive electronics simply couldn't survive. The British themselves had considered a proximity fuse for artillery in the late 1930s and concluded it couldn't be done. Not during this war, perhaps not ever. The electronics would shatter, the vacuum tubes would implode, the circuitry would fail. But the Americans had solved the impossible. At Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory in Maryland, a team led by physicist Merle Tuve had done what everyone said couldn't be done. They miniaturized vacuum tubes to fingernail size. They developed battery systems that could withstand 20,000 times the force of gravity without spilling acid. They created safety mechanisms that prevented the fuse from arming until the shell was hundreds of feet from the gun barrel, protecting the crew from premature detonation. They tested prototypes that failed 70% of the time and kept improving until the failure rate dropped to 5%. And they did all of this in total secrecy at over 100 factories across America, employing nearly 90,000 workers, most of whom had no idea what they were building. The first combat test came on January 5, 1943, off Guadalcanal. The cruiser USS Helena carried 500 rounds of the new ammunition, loaded in strictest secrecy under the supervision of Commander Deke Parsons, a naval ordnance expert who would later arm the atomic bomb on its way to Hiroshima. That morning, Japanese Val dive bombers attacked the American formation. Helena's gunners fired 2 salvos with the new fuses. The second salvo brought down a Val without touching it. The shell exploded in mid-air, and the bomber simply fell apart. The gunnery officer's report was succinct. The value of the Mark 32 Fuzed projectile cannot be too highly stressed. Admiral William Halsey, who commanded American naval forces in the South Pacific, immediately understood what he had. Night attacks by Japanese torpedo bombers, once nearly impossible to defend against in the dark, suddenly became death traps for the attackers. With radar to track the planes and VT Fuzes to destroy them at range, American ships could kill aircraft they couldn't even see. By late 1943, production of proximity Fuzes had ramped to 40,000 units per day. By mid-1944, every major American warship in the Pacific carried them. And the Japanese still didn't know. They suspected something, of course. After the war, Japanese officers admitted that the uncanny accuracy of American anti-aircraft fire was one of the factors that led to the adoption of kamikaze tactics in the first place. If conventional attacks couldn't get through because American gunners were somehow destroying aircraft before they could deliver their bombs or torpedoes, then perhaps suicide attacks, which required only that the pilot get close enough to crash into the target, might succeed where normal tactics failed. It was a calculation born of desperation and ignorance. The Japanese were changing their tactics to overcome a technological advantage they didn't understand and couldn't counter. But the kamikazes only walked deeper into the killing zone. The VT fuse was even more devastating against suicide attackers than conventional bombers, because kamikazes flew straight at their targets, making no evasive maneuvers in the final approach. They were trying to crash into the ships, which meant their flight path was predictable. For the VT fuse, a kamikaze was the perfect target: a predictable trajectory, a closing rate that allowed multiple shots, and an attacker who wouldn't pull away even when damaged. The statistics tell the story. Between October 1944 and August 1945, American naval guns fired hundreds of thousands of shells at attacking aircraft. When they used conventional timed Fuzes, they needed an average of over 1,000 rounds to bring down a single plane. With VT Fuzes, the average dropped to under 300 rounds per kill. In some engagements, the ratio was even more dramatic. During one action off Okinawa, the destroyers Hadley and Evans, along with 4 landing craft, faced 156 attacking kamikazes. The ships shot down 67 of them. The VT fuse was responsible for most of those kills. The secrecy surrounding the fuse was extraordinary. Every fuse carried a serial number. If a dud shell fell into enemy hands, the serial number could be traced back to the factory that produced it, allowing investigators to determine if there had been a security breach. Shells with VT fuses were shipped in sealed containers, and technical personnel who understood how the fuses worked carried documents in weighted briefcases designed to be thrown overboard if capture seemed imminent. For most of the war, VT fuses were forbidden in ground combat over land because of the risk that a dud might be recovered and reverse-engineered. Only over water, where failed shells would sink to the ocean floor, was their use authorized. The policy changed in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge, when General Eisenhower demanded permission to use the fuses against German troops in open ground. 200,000 shells with VT fuses were rushed to Europe, and they devastated German forces caught in the open. General Patton credited the fuse with saving the city of Liège and said it required a complete revision of land warfare tactics. But even then, strict orders were in place to keep the technology secret. The Japanese mounted a sustained effort to understand what was happening. Their engineers knew about radar. They understood radio frequencies. Some even speculated that the Americans might be using some kind of remote triggering system, perhaps transmitting a signal from the ship that detonated the shell when it was near a target. They were closer to the truth than they knew, but they missed the essential insight. The fuse was autonomous. It didn't rely on a signal from the ship. It was a self-contained radar system that operated independently, making its own decisions about when to detonate. That level of miniaturization and ruggedness was beyond what Japanese engineers thought possible, given the state of electronics in the early 1940s. Late in the war, Japanese intelligence officers interrogated captured American sailors, probing for information about anti-aircraft tactics. They asked about fire control systems, radar techniques, ammunition types. The Americans had been thoroughly briefed. Say nothing about the VT fuse. If asked directly about proximity detonation, claim ignorance. Some prisoners, knowing their interrogators would assume they were lying, told partial truths. Better ammunition, one sailor said. Improved quality control. The Japanese wrote it down, analyzed it, and concluded the Americans had simply gotten better at manufacturing conventional fuses. They never guessed that inside each shell was a radio transmitter smaller than a postage stamp, a receiver that could detect reflections from an aircraft hundreds of feet away, and vacuum tubes that could survive forces that would turn a human body to paste. The Germans came closer to the truth. German scientists had developed over 30 different proximity fuse designs for anti-aircraft rockets and bombs, including systems using radio, optical, and acoustic triggers. But they dismissed the idea of putting such mechanisms in artillery shells as impossible. The G-forces were too high, the spin rates too extreme, electronics that delicate would never survive. When German officers were interrogated after the war and shown the American VT fuse, they were stunned. "We knew it was theoretically possible," one engineer admitted. "We simply didn't believe it could be made practical." The Japanese reaction was similar. They had developed a photoelectric proximity fuse for aerial bombs late in the war, a device that used pulsing light to detect targets. But for artillery shells fired from guns, they had concluded what the Germans concluded: it couldn't be done. Not with vacuum tubes, not with the technology available in the 1940s. They were wrong, and their mistake cost them dearly. By the time of the Okinawa campaign in the spring of 1945, the VT fuse had evolved into a mature, reliable weapon system. The early shells had failure rates as high as 20%. By 1945, the rate was down to 5%, and some batches performed even better. Production had reached 70,000 units per day, and American industry was ready to produce millions more if the war continued. More importantly, American tactics had evolved to maximize the fuse's effectiveness. Destroyers on radar picket duty were specifically positioned to intercept kamikaze attacks before they could reach the aircraft carriers. These ships, stationed 50 to 100 miles north of Okinawa, directly in the path of Japanese aircraft coming from Kyushu, served as both early warning systems and killing zones. The radar picket destroyers became the most dangerous assignment in the United States Navy. Of the 26 destroyers assigned to picket duty during the Okinawa campaign, 15 were hit by kamikazes. 10 were sunk or damaged so severely they had to be scuttled. Over 1,000 sailors died on those picket stations. But the destroyers did their job. They broke up kamikaze formations before they could reach the main fleet, forcing the Japanese to expend aircraft against heavily armed warships instead of vulnerable carriers and transports. And they did it with VT fuses, which gave them a fighting chance against overwhelming numbers. Consider the experience of USS Bush on April 6, 1945. Stationed at Radar Picket Station No. 1 with her sister ship Colhoun, the Bush detected a massive inbound raid. Over 40 aircraft, all kamikazes, headed straight for their position. Commander Roland Westholm ordered his crew to battle stations and waited. The kamikazes came in waves. The Bush's 5-inch guns opened up at maximum range, their VT-fused shells creating a barrier of airbursts that shredded the first wave of attackers. 3 Zeros exploded in mid-air, torn apart by shrapnel before they could get close. A 4th took heavy damage and crashed into the sea hundreds of yards short of the ship. But more kept coming. The Japanese had learned that radar picket destroyers were killing machines, so they began attacking in overwhelming numbers, accepting losses to ensure some aircraft would get through. The Bush's gunners worked with desperate speed, loading shells, tracking targets, firing salvos that erupted into black flowers of destruction across the sky. The VT fuses were performing exactly as designed, detonating when they sensed aircraft nearby, creating kill zones that conventional shells could never match. But there were too many targets. A Zero broke through the barrage and crashed into the Bush's port side, killing the helmsman and jamming the rudder. Minutes later, another Zero slammed into the forward gun mount, igniting ammunition. The ship was dying, but her guns kept firing. A 3rd kamikaze hit amidships, breaking the Bush's back. She sank within minutes, taking 24 men with her, but her sister ship Colhoun had been saved by those final salvos. The Bush's guns had destroyed enough kamikazes to thin the attack, giving Colhoun time to maneuver and fight back. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The pattern repeated across the radar picket line. Destroyers fought desperate battles against odds that should have been impossible to survive. The destroyer Laffey, on April 16th, faced 22 kamikazes in 80 minutes and was hit 6 times but survived, her crew fighting fires and manning damaged guns, while VT-fused shells continued to pour into the sky. The destroyer Hainsworth shot down 7 kamikazes in a single engagement, every kill attributed to proximity-fused ammunition. The destroyer Cassin Young was hit twice by kamikazes but kept fighting, her undamaged guns downing 3 more attackers with VT shells before the ship finally had to withdraw for repairs. The Japanese couldn't understand why they were losing so many aircraft. Intelligence reports from surviving pilots described American anti-aircraft fire as impossibly accurate. Some pilots reported seeing shells explode near their aircraft without any visible impact, as if the Americans had developed some kind of proximity trigger. But Japanese high command dismissed these reports as combat stress or exaggeration. Proximity fuses were theoretically possible, but practically impossible. The technology required simply didn't exist. What the pilots were describing must be some combination of excellent radar fire control and lucky timing. Except it wasn't luck. It was physics, engineering, and industrial might. The Americans had cracked the problem through brute force innovation. The vacuum tubes inside each VT fuse were masterpieces of miniaturization. Sylvania Electric Products, working in factories in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, developed tubes with glass envelopes thinner than a human hair, electrodes smaller than grains of rice, and internal structures designed to flex under stress rather than shatter. The tubes were packed in dielectric wax that distributed shock forces evenly, preventing the delicate filaments from breaking during the extreme acceleration of firing. The battery that powered the fuse was a marvel of chemical engineering, a reserve battery that only activated when centrifugal force from the shell's spin threw electrolyte onto electrodes, creating current. This meant the fuse was completely inert during storage and transport, activating only after being fired. Safety features were built into every layer of the design. The fuse wouldn't arm until the shell had traveled at least 300 feet from the gun, ensuring that even a catastrophic malfunction couldn't endanger the crew. A self-destruct mechanism detonated any shell that didn't find a target within a preset time, preventing duds from falling intact where they might be recovered. The radio transmitter operated at frequencies specifically chosen to minimize interference from radar and other shipboard electronics. The receiver was sensitive enough to detect reflections from an aircraft at 70 feet, but insensitive to reflections from the ocean surface or friendly ships. Every component was tested, refined, tested again, and refined again, until the system worked with battlefield reliability. The production effort was staggering. Over 22 million VT fuses were manufactured during the war at a cost of over $1 billion in 1940s currency, equivalent to roughly $15 billion today. 87 different companies worked on various components, coordinating production across 110 factories. Workers, most of them women, assembled the delicate electronics by hand, straining their eyes over miniature parts they weren't allowed to discuss outside the factory walls. Security was so tight that police and firefighters weren't permitted to enter the production facilities even during emergencies. Workers were searched when entering and leaving, forbidden from carrying purses or bags that might conceal documents or components. The secrecy extended to the operational level. Ammunition officers aboard ships were ordered to keep VT-fused shells separate from conventional ammunition and to load them only when action was imminent. If a ship was in danger of capture, standing orders required dumping all VT ammunition overboard. Gun crews were briefed on the superior performance of the new shells, but not on how they worked. Most sailors knew only that the funny fuse was devastatingly effective and highly classified. Some gunners, curious about the unusual appearance of the fuse's nose, tried to examine fired duds recovered from the water. They were immediately ordered to stop and threatened with court-martial. The technology was to remain secret at all costs. By the time of Japan's surrender in August 1945, the VT fuse had fundamentally altered naval warfare. Statistics compiled after the war showed that VT-fused ammunition was 3 to 4 times more effective than conventional time fuses against aircraft, and night kill ratios had increased by 370%. During the Okinawa campaign alone, where kamikaze attacks were most intense, proximity-fused shells accounted for over half of all Japanese aircraft shot down by naval gunfire, despite making up only a quarter of the shells fired. An analysis published in Ralph Baldwin's book, The Deadly Fuse, concluded that of 278 aircraft destroyed by VT-fused projectiles between October 1944 and August 1945, only 46 would have been destroyed using conventional fuses. The Japanese never developed an effective countermeasure because they never fully understood what they were facing. German scientists had theorized that a radio proximity fuse could be jammed by broadcasting interfering signals, and American researchers confirmed this was possible. A simple 50-watt transmitter in an aircraft could theoretically trigger VT fuses prematurely, causing them to detonate thousands of feet from their targets. The Americans took this threat seriously. During the invasion of Italy, the Navy broadcast spurious radio signals while firing VT-fused shells, creating electromagnetic noise that would mask the fuse's actual operating frequency. If the Germans were listening with sophisticated receivers, they would hear only confusion, not the telltale signature of proximity detonation. But the Japanese never attempted jamming, because they never confirmed that radio proximity fuzzes were being used. They suspected, they speculated, they theorized, but they never knew for certain. Some Japanese engineers proposed developing their own proximity fuse late in the war, but the project never moved beyond the experimental stage. Resources were too scarce, time was too short, and the fundamental problem remained. They didn't believe electronics could survive being fired from a gun. Even if they had captured an intact VT fuse and reverse-engineered it, Japanese industry lacked the precision manufacturing capability to produce miniature vacuum tubes in the quantities required. The Americans had a 2-year head start in production techniques, and that gap was insurmountable. The human cost of this technological imbalance was staggering. Japanese kamikaze attacks between October 1944 and August 1945 resulted in nearly 5,000 American casualties, with over 2,000 sailors killed and another 3,000 wounded. But Japanese losses were catastrophic. Nearly 3,000 kamikaze sorties were launched during the war, and the success rate, even against ships equipped with VT fuses, was only around 10 to 15%. This meant that 85% of kamikaze pilots died without successfully hitting their targets. Many were shot down by fighters, but a significant portion were destroyed by VT-fused anti-aircraft fire. The shells exploding in mid-air, seemingly anticipating where the aircraft would be, must have seemed like black magic to the pilots. Some survived their first attack and returned to base with stories of American shells that could see. Others never made it back, their aircraft disintegrating under shrapnel bursts that appeared from nowhere. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was severe. Training for kamikaze missions was already traumatic, requiring young men to accept certain death for a slim chance of sinking an American ship. But reports from the few who survived their missions and had to fly again described a new terror, the feeling that American defenses had become impenetrable, that no matter how skillfully they flew, the shells would find them. Some pilots began requesting assignment to early waves of attacks, reasoning that it was better to die quickly than to watch comrades ahead being shredded by impossibly accurate fire. Japanese commanders, desperate to maintain morale, downplayed the reports and emphasized successes. But the truth was undeniable. American ships were becoming harder to hit, and the cost in aircraft was unsustainable. On radar picket destroyers, where the concentration of VT-fused ammunition was highest, the advantage was even more pronounced. These ships, often operating alone or in pairs far from the main fleet, faced the full fury of kamikaze attacks without support from carrier aircraft. They relied entirely on their guns and their radar to survive. The VT fuse gave them a fighting chance. Destroyers like the Aaron Ward, which shot down between 25 and 30 kamikazes during the Okinawa campaign, most with proximity-fuzzed shells, proved that even small warships could defend themselves against overwhelming odds if equipped with the right technology. But the advantage came at a cost. VT fuses were expensive compared to conventional fuses, and supply was limited, especially early in the war. Ships had to balance their ammunition loads, carrying a mix of proximity-fuzzed and timed shells to ensure they wouldn't run out during extended engagements. Ammunition officers developed rules of thumb: use VT fuses against high-priority targets like kamikazes, save conventional shells for suppressive fire and harassment. Gun crews had to make split-second decisions about which fuse type to load based on the tactical situation. The mental calculus was brutal. This target is worth a VT shell, that one is not. Lives literally depended on getting the decision right. The destroyer crews who survived the radar picket line carried memories that would haunt them for decades. Seaman First Class Thomas Whalen, who served aboard the USS Hadley during the battle off Okinawa on May 11th, 1945, recalled the morning in an interview 40 years later. "We could see them coming from miles away," he said. "Dozens of them, more than I could count. I thought we were dead. But our guns, they just kept firing, and the kamikazes kept exploding. Not hitting them, just exploding near them. I didn't understand it then. I thought maybe God was on our side that day. God, and $1 billion secret fitted into shells the size of a thermos bottle." The Hadley and her companion ship Evans faced 156 kamikazes in 90 minutes. The ship's 5-inch guns, loaded with VT-fused ammunition, created a wall of airbursts that destroyed aircraft faster than the crews could count. When the action ended, the Hadley had been hit 4 times and Evans 3 times, but both ships survived. Their guns had accounted for 99 confirmed kills between them. The Navy Bureau of Personnel later called the VT Fuzes' performance indispensable to the ship's survival. Without it, both destroyers would have been overwhelmed in the first 15 minutes. With it, they bought enough time for damage control teams to fight fires, patch holes, and keep the guns firing. But not every ship was so fortunate. The destroyer Drexler, on May 28, 1945, was hit by 2 kamikazes within seconds of each other. The first struck the starboard side, the second hit near the bridge. The ship broke in half and sank in 49 seconds, killing 158 men. Her guns had been firing VT-fused shells until the moment of impact, destroying several attackers, but the sheer number of kamikazes in that particular raid overwhelmed her defences. It was a brutal reminder that technology, no matter how advanced, couldn't guarantee survival when the odds were impossibly stacked. As the war ground toward its conclusion in the summer of 1945, American intelligence officers began to wonder what the Japanese actually knew about the VT fuse. Captured documents contained references to unusually accurate American anti-aircraft fire, but no technical details about proximity detonation. Some reports speculated about radar-controlled shell detonation, a system where the ship would transmit a signal to explode the shell when radar indicated it was near a target. The idea was close enough to worry American security officers. If the Japanese were thinking along those lines, they might eventually deduce the truth, but captured Japanese pilots, when interrogated, revealed a different picture. They knew American shells were exploding without impact. They knew the accuracy was beyond anything timed Fuzes could achieve, but they had no idea how it worked, and their superiors didn't believe them when they described what they'd seen. One pilot, shot down and rescued by American forces off Iwo Jima, asked his interrogators directly, "How do you make the shells explode before they hit?" The American officer, following protocol, feigned ignorance. "I'm just a Navy lieutenant," he said. "I don't know anything about ammunition. We just load it and fire it." The pilot shook his head in frustration. "Your gunners shoot better at night than we shoot in daylight. That's not normal. Something is different about your shells." The interrogator filed his report, noting that the pilot suspected advanced fusing but had no technical knowledge. The secret held. It held until the war ended. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast that reached every corner of the shattered empire. Kamikaze pilots, many of whom had been preparing for one final massive assault on the expected American invasion fleet, learned their war was over. Some wept in relief. Others, indoctrinated to believe that death in battle was the only honourable end, felt betrayed. But all of them would soon learn something that would fundamentally reshape their understanding of the battles they'd fought. Within months, as American occupation forces moved into Japan and technical experts began interviewing Japanese military personnel, the truth about the VT fuse emerged. Japanese engineers were shown captured American shells and allowed to examine the fuses. Their reaction was a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "We considered this impossible," one Japanese ordnance officer admitted during a technical debrief. We knew the theory. We understood radar. But to make it survive being fired from a gun? To make it work reliably in combat? We thought the Americans would need another 10 years of development. Another engineer, examining a VT fuse under a microscope, marveled at the miniature vacuum tubes. "This is extraordinary precision," he said. "Our factories could not have produced these, not in wartime, perhaps not even in peace. The quality control required is beyond our industrial capability." It was a humbling admission for a nation that had prided itself on technical prowess and attention to detail. The Americans had simply out-engineered them, and the gap was so wide that the Japanese hadn't even realized it existed until the war was over. German engineers had similar reactions. When shown VT fuses after Germany's surrender, Luftwaffe technical officers were astounded. "If we had known the Americans possessed this technology," one said, "we would have completely revised our tactics. Perhaps we would not have lost so many aircraft." Another German scientist pointed out that Germany had developed proximity fuses for rockets and bombs, but had dismissed artillery shell applications as impractical. "We were wrong," he said simply. "The Americans proved we were wrong." The admission carried weight because German engineering was considered among the best in the world. If the Germans had concluded something was impossible, most other nations accepted that judgment. The Americans had ignored conventional wisdom and succeeded anyway. The revelation of the VT fuse's existence came in stages. In September 1945, just weeks after the Japanese surrender, the technology was declassified and publicly announced. Newspapers ran stories about the secret weapon that won the war, though most focused on the atomic bomb. The VT fuse received less attention despite being used far more widely and arguably saving more American lives. A few technical journals published detailed articles explaining how the fuse worked, complete with diagrams and specifications. Former kamikaze pilots, reading these articles in the wreckage of their defeated nation, finally understood what they had faced. The shells hadn't been magic. They'd been science. Yoshio Shiga, a kamikaze pilot who had survived 3 missions and been grounded after the third due to aircraft shortages, learned about the VT fuse in 1946 while working in a Tokyo factory. A friend showed him an American military magazine left behind by occupation forces. The magazine contained a technical article about proximity fuses, illustrated with cutaway diagrams showing the miniature components inside. Shiga stared at the page for a long time. "I flew through that," he said quietly. "I watched planes ahead of me explode for no reason I could see. I thought the Americans had perfect aim, perfect timing. I didn't know their shells had eyes." He folded the magazine carefully and walked away. When asked later about his feelings on learning the truth, he said only, "We never had a chance. Not against that. We were brave, but bravery isn't enough when the enemy can see the future." The psychological impact on Japanese veterans was profound. Many had convinced themselves that American success was due to numerical superiority, industrial capacity, and perhaps better training. But the VT fuse represented something harder to accept, a fundamental technological advantage that couldn't be overcome through courage or tactics. The Americans hadn't just had more ships and planes, they'd had better weapons, so much better that Japanese forces were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs without even knowing it. Some veterans felt anger at their own military leadership for failing to develop comparable technology. Others felt a strange relief that their defeats had been inevitable, that no amount of sacrifice could have changed the outcome. For American veterans, the declassification brought its own complex emotions. Many sailors learned for the first time exactly how the shells they'd been firing actually worked. "We knew they were special," recalled James Morrison, a gunner's mate aboard the destroyer Laffey. "We were told not to talk about them, that they were top secret. But we didn't know they had tiny radios inside. When I found out, I felt proud. We were using technology that was 5-10 years ahead of anything else in the world. That's American ingenuity right there." Others reflected on how many lives the fuse had saved. The destroyer Hugh W. Hadley's executive officer, interviewed in the 1980s, estimated that without VT fuses, his ship would have lasted maybe 10 minutes against the kamikaze attack it survived. "Every man who came home from that ship," he said, "owes his life to the scientists who invented that fuse and the workers who built it." Scientists themselves had mixed feelings about their creation. Merle Tuve, who had led the development effort at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, rarely spoke publicly about the VT fuse after the war. When he did, he emphasized the collaborative nature of the project, the contributions of hundreds of engineers and technicians whose names would never be known. "We built a tool," he said in a 1953 interview, "a very effective tool. Whether that tool was used wisely, whether the war itself was necessary, those are questions beyond my expertise. I'm a physicist. I solved a physics problem. The moral questions belong to others." It was a carefully neutral statement that avoided both pride and regret. James Van Allen, who worked on vacuum tube development for the fuse and later discovered the Earth's radiation belts, was more forthcoming. "The VT fuse saved lives," he said in a 1993 interview, 50 years after the first combat use. "American lives, primarily, but also Japanese lives in a perverse way. The fuse made kamikaze attacks so costly that they became unsustainable. If the attacks had been more successful, the war might have lasted longer, and more people on both sides would have died. Sometimes the best weapon is the one that ends the fight quickly." Van Allen acknowledged the ethical complexity of building weapons while insisting that in the context of World War II, where the alternative was likely higher casualties on all sides, the VT fuse was a net positive. The technology's legacy extended far beyond World War II. Proximity fuzzes became standard equipment in military arsenals worldwide, evolving from vacuum tube designs to solid-state electronics and eventually to sophisticated laser and radar systems. Modern anti-aircraft missiles use proximity fuses as a matter of course, and the principle of autonomous target detection pioneered by the VT fuse laid groundwork for smart weapons of all kinds. In a very real sense, every guided missile, every precision munition, every weapon system that can make its own targeting decisions traces its lineage back to that miniature radio transmitter spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute inside a 5-inch shell over the Pacific Ocean in 1945. The factories that produced VT fuses during the war converted to peacetime production, but the expertise they'd developed in miniaturization and precision manufacturing fed into the post-war electronics boom. Sylvania, which had manufactured millions of miniature vacuum tubes for proximity fuzzes, became a major player in the television and radio industries. Crosley Corporation, another major VT fuse manufacturer, used its wartime experience to develop better consumer electronics. The skills that had gone into building weapons helped build the modern world of miniaturized electronics. The engineers who had learned to make circuits small enough to fit in an artillery shell went on to make radios small enough to fit in a pocket, then computers small enough to fit on a desk, and eventually processors small enough to fit on a fingernail. In Japan, the revelation about the VT fuse contributed to a broader reckoning with the country's wartime technology gap. Japanese engineers in the 1950s and 60s studied American industrial techniques intensively, determined to close the gap that had contributed to their defeat. The focus on miniaturization, quality control, and precision manufacturing that characterized post-war Japanese industry owed something to the humbling lesson of the proximity fuse. If American factories could produce 22 million complex electronic devices during wartime, devices so sophisticated they seemed impossible, then Japanese industry would have to match and exceed that capability to remain competitive. The result was an industrial resurgence that transformed Japan from a defeated power into an economic superpower within a generation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The destroyer USS Laffey, which survived 22 kamikaze attacks off Okinawa in April 1945, is preserved as a museum ship in Charleston, South Carolina. Visitors can walk her decks and see the 5-inch gun mounts that fired VT-fused shells during that desperate 80-minute battle. Docents, many of them veterans, explain how the proximity fuse worked and why it mattered. They show photographs of the damage the ship sustained and point out where kamikazes struck, but they also emphasize something harder to photograph: the terror of facing an enemy willing to die, and the relief of having a weapon that actually worked when everything depended on it. In museums across America and Japan, proximity fuses are displayed behind glass, anonymous-looking cylinders of metal and electronics that changed the course of naval warfare. The labels explain the technology: miniature radar, vacuum tubes, centrifugal batteries, safety mechanisms. But they can't fully convey what it meant to the men who used them or faced them. For American gunners, the VT fuse was hope, a tool that gave them a fighting chance when kamikazes filled the sky. For Japanese pilots, it was invisible death, shells that exploded where they shouldn't, destroying aircraft through some mechanism they couldn't understand or avoid. And for the engineers and workers who built 22 million of these devices in secret, it was proof that impossible problems could be solved if enough smart people worked together with sufficient resources and determination. The kamikazes never knew what killed them. Most died instantly when VT-fused shells detonated nearby, shrapnel tearing through aluminum and flesh before their brains could register what had happened. A few survived long enough to realize their aircraft was falling, controls shredded, engine failing, the American ship they'd been diving toward now impossibly distant. But none of them understood in that final moment that they'd been killed by a weapon that could see, by a shell that had sensed their presence and detonated at exactly the right instant to maximize damage. The Japanese military never fully grasped during the war that American destroyers were shooting down aircraft they couldn't visually see in darkness or clouds, that the shells were making their own targeting decisions independent of the gunner's aim. That knowledge came only after surrender, too late to matter, except as a lesson for future wars. The VT proximity fuse killed tens of thousands of Japanese aviators. It saved thousands of American sailors. It shortened the Pacific War by making Japanese suicide tactics unsustainable. And it did all of this in almost complete secrecy, one of the best-kept secrets of World War II, guarded as closely as the atomic bomb project. The Japanese never knew, which is perhaps the most remarkable part of the story. For 2.5 years, from January 1943 to August 1945, American ships fired shells that contained miniature radar systems, and the Japanese never figured it out. They suspected, they theorized, they speculated, but they never knew. And by the time the truth was revealed, the war was over, and the lesson was written in wreckage and memory. In modern war, the side with better technology doesn't just have an advantage, they have the power to make the enemy's courage meaningless, to render their tactics obsolete, to kill them in ways they can't comprehend or counter. The proximity fuse was America's invisible victory, won not on the battlefield but in laboratories and factories, by scientists who solved problems that seemed impossible, and workers who built millions of flawless copies of a device so complex it bordered on miraculous. It was victory through innovation, through the stubborn refusal to accept that something couldn't be done just because no one had done it before. And perhaps that, more than any specific battle or weapon, exemplifies how America fought World War II, not with the largest army or the bravest soldiers, but with the willingness to build what needed to be built, to invent what needed to be invented, and to keep those inventions secret until they'd won the war. The morning of April 11th, 1945, when Ensign Robert Karr watched kamikazes explode in mid-air around his destroyer, he didn't know he was witnessing the culmination of years of secret development, billions of dollars in investment, and the combined effort of nearly 90,000 American workers. He just knew the shells were working, that planes were falling from the sky, that maybe he'd survive to see another dawn, and that, in the end, was enough. The science was hidden, the technology was secret, but the result was visible to everyone. American ships defended themselves with uncanny accuracy, and Japanese kamikazes died without understanding why. By the time Japan surrendered 4 months later, the question of why had become academic. The war was over, the secret was revealed, and the lesson was clear. Technology wins wars, but only if you can keep it secret long enough to use it. The VT proximity fuse, the weapon the Japanese never knew they were fighting, the invisible killer in the Pacific sky, the proof that sometimes the most devastating weapon is the one your enemy doesn't believe exists until it's far too late to matter. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.